Hi, this is Eric Cressy, and thanks for joining us here on our second installment of this series of webinars. In our first webinar, you may recall that we talked about the reason you may not be making optimal progress in your strength conditioning program is because it's not individualized to your unique needs. And with that in mind, we wanted to take this separate opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what you would actually look at when you want to create a real strength conditioning program that may be more suited to what you actually need. There's this perception that one can't gain muscle, lose fat, get strong, become more athletic, and get healthier simultaneously. A lot of people seem to think that these are several goals that are mutually exclusive, but in reality, I disagree wholeheartedly because we've seen people at our facility do it countless times. Just off the top of my head, probably our best example is going to be our professional athletes who get back after long seasons where they're a little bit beaten down physically, and they're in a position where they're really primed for making a lot of progress on all these fronts at the same time. In reality, though, when we deal with the general population, it can go on kind of two different ends of the spectrum. On one hand, someone who's very untrained and doesn't have a whole lot of experience, or someone who even has some experience but hasn't really used effective programming, they can definitely do all these things at the same time. On the other hand, you have people who may be very experienced with strength conditioning, who may struggle to gain muscle and lose fat at the same time, because those are the two goals that are really at odds with one another. The rest of them can all kind of take place at the same time. So, we're going to look at some of the factors that you have to look at in an ideal program here to make sure that you are getting the most bang for your buck in your quest to get to all these goals. But there are some important prerequisites that we do need to take into account. First, I think you need to be really honest with yourself about a number of factors. First, your age. The older you are, the harder it is to really push training volume hard. Your training experience. Someone who may be brand new to training, the tendency is to want to run and see what all the elite athletes are doing for their training programs. But in reality, if you're really new to training, you probably don't need that super advanced approach. Also, your training environment. Do you have spotters around so that you can maybe take a few more risks with certain exercise selections or loading protocols? Likewise, what's your equipment access like? We have people that say, I work out in my basement and I've got a kettlebell and a broken band and a rickety old, dumbbell set that doesn't match up. But, a lot of times that's going to make it very, very hard to achieve an optimal training effect. So we've got to be cognizant of all these things. So I think it's just really, really important that everything's in line with your goals above all else, is that you can't ride two horses with one saddle. And we have people that say, I want to run a marathon, I want to compete in a powerlifting meet, and I want to be elite in both. In reality, that's just not the case. So those are things that you need to decide for yourself before you do decide to take a run at these programming objectives and really try to figure out what's the right thing for you. So with that said, we're going to talk about 8 factors that I think are essential to consider when you write a program. And these are things that are always in the back of my head when I write programs for everyone, whether it's a 13-year-old athlete, whether it's a professional baseball player, whether it's a 25-year-old power lifter, or whether it's someone who's 55 years old and is a little bit more beat up and is just trying to get healthy and overcome what they're dealing with sitting at a desk job all day. So I think ease of application and interpretation is an important thing to consider, and that's the number one thing that I want you to appreciate, is that a good program should not confuse you. Okay, it should excite, it should motivate you. You should be excited when you get it because you know that you know how to interpret it, you know how to apply it, pretty quickly and easily. So, I use the example of our programming template at Cressy Performance over here on the right, just A1, A2, B1, B2, kind of superset pairing that just shows it doesn't have to be super complex. In fact, the more complex it is, the more confusing it is, and the less likely you are to be really, really adherent to it. So a good program should allow for easy progress tracking. You'll see that on this sheet to the right, guys can quickly and easily compare what they did in week 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. You can see how that's structured. But it should also really align with your training environment. So, I'm not going to give you a bunch of exercises that don't fit with your equipment, that may be too high risk for you in the context of not having a spotter on hand. Maybe I'm going to not give you a program that's involving 9 different exercises at the same time as part of a circuit, because I know you work out in a commercial gym where you're not going to be able to get all that stuff at your fingertips. But I think it's also aligned with your fitness level and your training experience. That's going to dictate a lot of factors, and I think the other thing, and probably most important, is where is your current level of motivation. If I put this in front of you, are you going to think it's all or nothing and say, hey, this is just too complex, I'm going to walk away because I'm not ready for it? Or is it the kind of thing that's going to match up to where you are right now and allow you to be excited about moving forward with it? So talking about versatility a little bit, a good program is not good unless it's actually sustainable. So if I give you a program that injures you or doesn't suit your lifestyle well, that's not the kind of versatility that we want. So I think the question is, does it really fit with your lifestyle? Is it something that's going to require you to train for 3 hours a day, 6 days a week when you have a job and a family and all these other responsibilities that are competing for your attention? So frequency, duration, volume, these are all factors that can come up or down depending on what it is you have going on in your life. And when we did the Show and Go product, for instance, one of the things I wanted to make sure of is that we had options for different training frequencies. Some people like an upper body, lower body split, and they can get in the gym 4 days a week. Other people may only like to do the full body setup and do 3 days a week. Some people like, Dee Dee Griesbauer, who's one of our clients here on the top. Dee Dee's an elite triathlete. She only strength trains twice a week because she has so many competing demands. Whereas you compare her to Bree Schaff on the bottom here, who's one of our clients who's in bobsled for the USA here in the most recent Winter Olympics. And Bree is involved in a much heavier strength and power sport, so she actually does a lot more strength training than Dee Dee would need to. Okay, so her competing demands are dramatically different. So we want to match you up to your equipment. We want to match you up to any physical limitations that you may have going on. If you're someone who has, for instance, a femoral acetabular impingement, which is a bony overgrowth at your hip, we're not going to go out and squat you and really beat up on that hip, because we know that that's not something that's going to be good for you long term. And of course, training experience comes right back up again. The more trained you are, the more you're going to need a program that's specifically suited to you, just to make sure that you don't run into those issues that come along with being very neurally efficient and able to impose a lot more fatigue. And lastly, like I talked about with both Bree and with Dee Dee here, is that I have competing demands. Dee Dee has a lot more than Bree does in this case, and that may change as you get closer to competition time for Bree. So it just dictates what we do, and in reality, probably one of the areas where competing demands are the most pronounced is when we deal with metabolic conditioning. So the more someone needs to metabolically condition, kind of like Dee Dee, the more we're going to have to cut back on the strength training side of things, whereas Bree doesn't need really to be metabolically conditioned. So she's in a more pure strength and power sport. So lots of different factors to consider if you want to make a program versatile and allow many different people to use it. But I think the thing to appreciate, though, is if you get all the basics down, it just takes some tinkering to make it right for different people. And for me, the number one thing to look at is exercise selection. It's probably the most important acute programming variable that in my eyes dictates all the rest of the program. Sets and reps don't matter if an exercise hurts. So if I give you an exercise that isn't right for your body or your body at a certain time during the year, then the sets and reps I programs really don't matter. I think your exercise selection governs progressions and regressions. So if I give somebody a stability ball rollout and I find, they really can't maintain that neutral spine and good glute activation, and they slip into forward head posture, well, I'm going to regress it. I'm going to go back to a prone bridge and build up some anterior core strength there. Whereas if they really dominated that stability ball rollout, maybe I'm going to give them some rollouts with perturbations, or I'm going to give them an ab wheel rollout or something along those lines. So where you start someone dictates whether you take a step back in one direction or whether you take a step forward in another direction. I think the 80-20 rule is, as is the case with everything in life, is something that you can apply to your strength training programs as well, in that 80% of your results are probably going to come from 20% of your exercises. So that first movement in your training day is going to be where you impose a lot of your training stress and probably where you derive many of the benefits. So that speaks to a lot of things. It says that the assistance work is certainly important, but you never want to overlook the steak and go right to the potatoes. But I think it also means that if you get that 80% right, you can usually screw around a little bit with your training. If you're a guy who wants to do some direct arm work or some calf raises or something like that, as long as you're taking care of the 80%, I think that 20% gives you a little bit more wiggle room. So what do we look at in the context of exercise selection? Well, we break it up into several categories. A hip dominant movement would consist of things that strengthen the posterior chain. So deadlifts, good mornings, glute ham raises, pull throughs, things along those lines. Whereas a quad dominant lower body movement, which would be more of a front squat or anything, that tends to be more anteriorly dominant. Likewise, we have horizontal pushing and pulling. Horizontal push would be a bench press or a push up, whereas a horizontal pull would be any kind of rowing variation. We also have vertical pulling and pushing, where a vertical push would be an overhead press. A vertical pull would be something like a chin-up. We have single leg exercise, which I think are really overlooked by folks yet tremendously valuable. So lunges, split squats, one leg RDLs. And then we kind of divide our core training up into two components. One would be anti-rotation, so the ability of your core to resist destabilizing torques in the side-to-side manner. And then also anti-extension would be the ability of your core to not slip into excessive extension, in something like a prone bridge or a stability ball rollout or something like that. So you'll notice that several of these exercises or these categories are actually underlined, and the reason is very simply because those are the areas that most people need more of in their programming. So if I spend all day seated at a desk, chances are I'm going to need more work to learn to extend my hip well and get myself out of that kyphotic posture and really build up some good stability in single leg stance. So the whole idea of structural balance and training, matching one to the other, is probably not necessary, because I think we need to be in one direction more than the other to be balanced. So you also have to consider there are subcategories of all these exercises. I talked about with horizontal pushing, you have both push-up and bench press variations, which afford different results to you. So as you get more and more comfortable, you learn to play around with these and move in that direction. So if we're talking about just a hip dominant exercise, something like a sumo deadlift, where the athlete would sit right back, getting a good hamstring and glute activation at the top, neutral spine, chin tucked, good thoracic extension here, so the exact opposite of what you might get sitting at a desk all day. Horizontal pulling, a standing one arm cable row, definitely one of my favorites as well. Good way to really strengthen those scapular retractors. Gets the shoulder blade down and back. Builds a little bit of thoracic spine mobility as I work through it. And again, these are just the tip of the iceberg. There are plenty more opportunities to apply things. Vertical pull, just a basic chin up. Again, neutral cervical spine posture. I'm not really hyperextended. My chin's tucked. I'm looking straight ahead. Single leg exercise, the barbell reverse lunge with a front squat grip. Great way to build some what we call frontal plane stability. So making sure my knee doesn't cave in, or I don't tip over to one side. I'm just digging that front heel into the ground. Good hip extension on the back leg, so it's an active mobility exercise as well. I'm getting the benefits of some axial loading by having the bar across my shoulders as well. So it's a great exercise for folks who may not be able to squat deeply because of mobility restrictions or some other factor. Split stance cable lift. So this is some of the core stability here. Doesn't look like I'm really doing much when I do this exercise, but in reality, if you take a look, I'm really resisting the torque that cable applies to me. So it wants to pull me back towards the cable column, but I'm in this good lunge position, bracing my core nice and tight, activating my left glute, and I'm not allowing it to rotate me. Anti-extension, so a classic ab wheel rollout. I'm resisting the gravity forcing my lower back down into lumbar extension. So I brace my core nice and tight, activate my glutes together, and I'm just resisting that extension that's applied by gravity. So just an example of some of the different categories that we look at, and there are definitely factors that you have to look in even beyond strength training. So we look at our mobility approach. I don't think that strength training is a good idea unless you've worked to create adequate range of motion, because otherwise you really just re-ingrain dysfunction. So I think that's where a lot of people wind up with injuries on the strength training side of things, because they haven't really worked to build that mobility first. And there's always the debate over whether you're short or you're stiff. If you have shortness, it means that the muscles themselves have actually lost sarcomeres, or the actual functional unit of skeletal muscle. And those are the folks that are going to need a lot of aggressive soft tissue work and really longer duration static stretching. A lot of people are just stiff too, meaning that they need good mobility work to increase the temperature around that certain joint to allow for a little bit more range of motion. They probably need a little bit more stabilization at a joint next to it. So this is where the mobility exercises that you do and the flexibility programming you use interacts closely with your strength training stuff. So we usually start off with a full foam rolling session to kind of get to work on tissue quality and stimulate the nervous system in a little bit of a different way than we'd have at rest. And then once we get to our dynamic warm-ups, we use something like this drill, which is a walking Spider-Man with, high knee walk to walking Spider-Man to hip lift, and then into an overhead reach. So we do the knee hug, we get some full hip flexion, get some good hip separation from the back leg. In that bottom position, we get some ankle mobility, a little bit of groin stretch. We stretch out our hamstring. So we step through, get a little hip flexor length in the back leg, With that reach, we build some thoracic spine mobility. We get a little bit of length in our pec. This is a good catch-all mobility exercise. In fact, I contributed it to Men's Health a couple years ago, and they called it the microwave because it was a good idea for warming you up quickly. So ankle, hip, and thoracic spine mobility. So thoracic spine being our upper back. Those are some of our big focuses in the warm-up. And then you've got hip and scapular stabilizer activation. So we're always doing stuff to kind of get the hips and the upper back working the way we want to. So I think, don't overlook the fact that strength training through a full range of motion is absolutely imperative if you do want to improve your mobility. So, your range of motion might not be where it needs to be yet, but at the very least you need to create stability in what you have thus far. And we do some static stretching as well. Usually that's integrated at the end of an exercise session, just where it's probably best placed in the context of not interfering with strength and power gains and things along those lines that you may have heard about in the research. So, number 5, let's talk about fluctuations in training stress. And Kelly Baggett's a real good strength and conditioning coach and writer, and he introduced a term called, or a phrase, fatigue masks fitness. So, I'm a 660-pound deadlifter, but you know what? I don't do that every day of the week. Instead, I could probably go out and pull 600 just about any day of the week, but if I want to go out and really pull a max, I usually need some downtime. And why does that happen? Because, I've accumulated a lot of fatigue in my training, and I need to remove that fatigue in order to build the fitness that I need to perform at that level. So I think there's important differentiations to make between overtraining, overreaching, and overload. Overload is a consistent process in every single training session. You go out, you work a little bit harder than you did last time, and you adapt and you come back a little bit stronger. Overreaching is a little bit more of a longer term process. It probably takes place over several days or even weeks, where I intentionally impose a lot of fatigue, knowing that when I would remove that fatigue stimulus, that I'm going to get a little bit of a rebound. So, overreaching is actually something that's a good thing to put into programming as you get more and more advanced, because it shows you that you can push a little bit extra and probably derive a little bit more fitness as long as you allow the rebounding to take place. Overtraining, on the other hand, is a term that gets thrown out probably far too much, and in reality, true overtraining syndrome is a pretty nasty thing. In fact, in many ways, it rivals what you see with clinical depression. Obviously, there's a loss of performance, but you can see dramatic changes to endocrine markers, and people having lower testosterone to cortisol ratios. So most people wind up in overreaching and not overtraining. It takes a lot of training volume to get to that overtraining part. So learning how you can manipulate overload acutely to create overreaching a little bit more chronically can actually make a big difference for you getting where you need to be. So your goal is to impose fatigue, but not so much that you can't recover from it, and then you lower training stress, and that allows you to adapt. So there are different ways to impose that that training stress. It may be with extra volume, it may be with a higher intensity, it may be with a greater frequency of training. Regardless, my personal favorite way of removing stress is to load people for 3 weeks and then remove a little bit of that stress in that 4th week. So we may train folks on like a high, medium, very high, and then low approach with weeks 1 through 4. We may load consistently with straight volume for those first 3 weeks and then remove the stress in that week 4. So what you find is when you do it correctly, when you get to the beginning of what would be week 5, people should be really excited. I mean, they should be wanting to kick down the door to the gym to get in there and train, because they really do feel like they've attained some more fitness benefits. And that's true of whether you're dealing with strength training adaptations, cardiovascular exercise adaptations, whatever it may be. So adequate prehabilitation is another thing to look at. I think prehab is probably a term that gets thrown around a bunch, and with the whole corrective exercise industry taking off, I think a lot of people assume that you have to do hours and hours and hours of it, and that it slows down everything. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that think that all we do is mobility drills at our facility. But in reality, you want just enough to keep people healthy, but not so much that it slows things down excessively and makes exercise boring. We use it as part of fillers, warm-ups, corrective exercise circuits on off days, you name it. So just a way to get people moving a little bit differently. In this example, just a knee break ankle mobilization, keeping the heels down, elevating the front of the foot. All we're doing is we're getting a little bit of dorsiflexion range of motion by forcing our knees forward. This is a great drill to do just in between a set of deadlifts. It's pretty low level. There's not a whole lot of stress on you, and it's not something that's going to really occupy your mind between sets of heavier lifting. So things like this are very easy inclusions that can help you get to where you need to be. But here's the big white elephant in the room that nobody really wants to talk about, because it's really the thing that separates the good programs from the not so good programs, and what really dictates how well you're able to make use of all those different goals that I mentioned right at the beginning. It's the variable that can make or break a program. And I think it can also make a program very, very versatile if you know how to change things around. So the way I look at it, when you have a lot of metabolic conditioning in your program, whether that's distance running, whether it's intervals on the cycle, whether it's just movement training that an athlete might have as part of everyday practice, or sprinting sessions, there's always going to be a give and take with strength training. So when strength training volume goes up, metabolic conditioning probably has to go down. When metabolic conditioning goes up, strength training volume has to go down. So they're inherently at odds with each other, and you need to make sure that you take that into account. So what I think a lot of people run into issues because of, and probably even more so in the past couple of years, with some of the introductions of different training styles, is that you can't push everything at the same time. You can't be a jack of all trades and master of none. So I think a lot of people try to crank up metabolic conditioning volume without necessarily taking down the strength training volume at the same time. So it's very, very important that they don't kind of work against each other. So we look at like a greater emphasis on metabolic conditioning as something that mandates that we do a lot more soft tissue work and mobility. So volume can really beat people up. And why does this happen? I think it's not just the volume component, but it's more so that it's volume without a full range of motion. So we're usually exposed to greater ranges of motion in strength training than we can really get with most metabolic conditioning options. And that assumes metabolic conditioning being things like cycling, jogging, elliptical, rowing even. Those can be things where you get stuck in pattern overload. Sprinting would probably be an exception to this, where you do experience some greater joint range of motion. So for the most part, if you're just doing traditional cardio in a gym, or you're an Ironman competitor or something like that, you probably do need to work a lot harder on soft tissue quality with your foam rolling and massage, and any other kind of options with a manual therapist, but also your mobility exercises, both before you exercise and in terms of static stretching post-exercise. Number 8 and final one is matching intensity to training experience. So we talked about how exercise selection governs reps and sets, but in reality, matching intensity to training experience does so as well. So if you think about it in the context of the exercise intensity that I want to work at, if I want to work at 90% of my 1 rep max, I'm not going to give them 3 sets of 10. There's no way they could possibly use 10 reps on a 90% of 1 rep max load. So in reality, we have to consider what works at different levels. In beginners, the research has shown that beginners can make strength gains on as little as 40% of their 1 rep max. So it doesn't take a whole lot to get stronger at that level. And the reason is they're still figuring out movements. They're still learning how to coordinate their nervous system and their muscles to get the right kind of firing patterns to get where they need to be. So this is something that wears off pretty quickly, though. You're talking a couple of months, and then they need to kind of learn to work like intermediates. So for most intermediates, probably about a 70% of 1 rep max load is what they're going to need. So they can get by with a little bit less and still really hammer on technique, but it's getting to the point where it probably needs to be about a 12 rep max or 15 rep max load in order to really simulate some kind of strength gains. In my experience, this is where the overwhelming majority of people I encounter probably exist. The folks that read my newsletter and check out my blog and maybe have read gone through programs in some of my older products, they kind of hover in this intermediate zone, and they don't quite appreciate what it's going to take to get to that next level. And that's where the advanced training protocols or intensity protocols, I should say, come in. As you get more and more experience, you're just not going to get strong under 85 to 90% of your 1 rep max. And for me, I'll be the case study on this. Essentially, an 85 to 90% load would be anywhere from like a 3 to 5 rep max. So I'd say most people on average can probably do about 5 reps at 85% of their max. Most people, when they get to 90, it's probably 2 or 3, or some people only 1. So for me, a funny story, back in, good Lord, probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was absolutely stagnant at a 225 bench press. I couldn't do anything more than it. I missed 230 so many times I'm ashamed to even admit it. So probably went on for a full year. And one of the problems was I spent all this time doing sets of 4x6 and 5x5, and I just couldn't push past it. And the only thing that got me stronger, and it was pronounced. I mean, it was 50 pounds on my bench in a matter of a year, was spending more time in that 85 to 90 plus range. So I was doing a lot of heavier singles up in the 200 to 215 range, focusing on perfect technique, focusing on good bar speed, but still getting heavy weights in my hand. And when I started doing that heavier loading and the higher percentages, basically sets of 1 to 3, everything really started to click for me. So I was an intermediate that needed to find new protocols in order to get advanced. And obviously these are the things that can beat you down a little bit more, so you have to be careful about loading and unloading. But I see a lot of people that just don't spend enough time over 85% of their max, and even above 90. So if you can do that, that's a quick and easy way to get to a higher level. So if you want to summarize all this in a quick bullet point, you just say, the more experienced and neurally efficient you are, the fewer reps you can do at a given percent of your 1 rep max. So, I might be able to do 1 rep at 100% of my max, and maybe only 1 rep at 97%, and as I go under 95 and 90, I can probably get a couple of reps. Whereas you'll see a lot of beginners who can go to 90% and they can bang out 6 or 7 reps just because they're so neurally efficient that, they just haven't synced everything up the way that they need to get to that next level. So, that covers our 8 factors, but I think there are a few follow-up considerations that I really want to bring to light. Success comes from the interaction of great programming and effort in training and nutrition. So I say effort because I would much rather take someone with outstanding effort and a tremendous amount of motivation to really work hard, even if that person has an inferior program. So you can have the greatest program in the world, but if you're not willing to work, it won't matter at all. I'll take effort over programming any day. And where you really start to do things that are pretty special is when you combine the two. So do whatever you can in your power to try to improve your effort, your motivation, your energy, your environment around you. Get good training partners. Get into a good environment where there's loud music if that's your thing. So do whatever you need to do. And obviously what you do in the kitchen is also very, very important. It works synergistically with your programming. So synergy is everything. Progress is not just a sum of individual parts. It's how everything fits together. So, you can't recover from your strength training programs if you don't get adequate nutrition and sleep and all these factors in. So, really keep in mind that it's not just about, well, I did one thing right, I guess I'm doing pretty well. It's about how everything works together. That's where writing programs becomes as much of an art as it is a science. You have to appreciate that when you add something, you have to take something else away. There's a lot of competing demands and a lot of factors that influence success. The best way I can say to get better at writing programs is to write, train, learn from what worked and what didn't, and then modify future programs. I think it's also a great idea to observe programs from different professionals, but just make sure you're choosing wisely, because there are a lot of people out there who, believe it or not, especially in the internet marketing world, really aren't training people, which is pretty scary. They're writing out programs that are going out to thousands and thousands of people, and they're doing them, assuming that it was backed by a lot of science and experimentation, when in reality it wasn't, which is unfortunate because you got to choose wisely when you only have one body. So I want to bring to light Tim Collins. Tim's one of our poster boys, so to speak, at Cressy Performance. He was 5'5", 131 pounds when we first started with him, right after he finished up high school. He was signed by the Blue Jays back in the day as an undrafted free agent, and here we are in 2011, and he's actually in the big leagues with the Kansas City Royals. So Tim went from 5'5", 131 pounds, all the way up to just over 170 pounds in these photos. He's got a 39-inch vertical jump, and he's a freaky athlete. So it's not really something I just want to show you as a good before-after picture, although there's something to be said about what Tim did, and that he really just focused heavily on performance. All his goal was to get stronger, to do what it took to become a better pitcher, and you see his body weight changes, and the way that he morphed his body is pretty pronounced. So I think the more important example comes from the media celebration of when Tim went to the big leagues this year. And what happened was there was a great story at Yahoo Sports, and Men's Health also picked it up, and I wrote some stuff in my blog. And after Tim went to the big leagues, you had this incredible influx of emails to our account at the facility of people saying, "Hey, you know what? Can you just send me Tim's program? I'm a 5'7" lefty just like him. Like, I really feel like I'm just a few programs away from going to the big leagues." And the truth is that it's a very short-sighted perception. For one, I wouldn't just email email them 50 Excel spreadsheets with programs in it. But I think more importantly, it shows that a lot of these people don't really appreciate that it wasn't just the what, it was the how, it was the when, it was the why, it was the who. There are not a lot of people that are willing to put in the work that Tim did. So he's a poster boy, and he's living his dream, but in reality I think his experience and people's responses to it probably can tell us just as much about what it takes to be successful. It's not just a programming, although a program can be very, very important. So as a little step inside my world, I just did the math on it the other day, and I found that I did 114 programs in the month of September. This is a pretty average month for us. We don't have our college guys around right now. Our pro guys are probably just starting to get back, at the beginning of September. So it's a pretty average month. It'll get busier in October, November, December, and January and February will be absolutely crazy. So some months it'll be a little slower, some months it'll be busier. So just doing the math on this, figure 114 programs at 15 minutes per program. That's about 1,710 minutes per month, which is about 28.5 hours per month. So if you consider someone going to a seminar, every Saturday for 7 hours, that's pretty much what I do on programming. So that works out to about 342 hours per year. I don't know if any of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which is a fantastic read, but he talks about for mastery of any profession, if you want to be really, really successful, that it really takes about 10,000 hours to be good at something. So imagine trying to do 10,000 hours of programming. That's in the context of what I have going on, that's 29.2 years of actually writing programs. So I'd estimate that I'm probably at about 5,000 hours of programming alone, and that doesn't include me being on the training floor supervising athletes going through those programs. It doesn't include me sitting through continuing education experiences like seminars and going to travel and visit other coaches. So I'm over that 10,000 hours by far with the training side of things, but to think about doing it just for programming is a pretty lofty task, and it's honestly a reason why a lot of people outsource their programming. I hire an accountant to do my taxes. I hire a lawyer if I need a contract. There's something to be said about finding someone who's really, really comfortable with this stuff to write your strength and conditioning programs if you aren't going to be able to put in the time and the effort to really retest with this. So the truth is, when you think you've got it, it's probably time to retire, because that's a lot of work to put in. So where do you begin when it comes to writing your own programs? I think it's important to try pre-made programs to discover what works for you. Try programs out of books, stuff you've seen on DVDs, programs that you've seen your friends and athletes that you've surrounded yourself with who have had good results. In reviewing these principles, look for key principles that I outline in this webinar. So if someone hands you a program in a book, take a look at it and get a feeling for, is there plenty of horizontal pulling? Is there some single leg exercise in there? Do they teach me to foam roll at the beginning? Do they give me mobility drills? Should I be doing some static stretching? Hey, is the metabolic conditioning in line with the strength and conditioning stuff there? Or, is it excessive and there's too much strength training for the amount of mobility or metabolic conditioning stuff that you're doing? There's a lot of different factors that are going to be competing with one another. So you're going to borrow bits and pieces from different schools of thought and use them to create your own philosophy. And I think above all else, you got to appreciate that your philosophy is going to be very dynamic, because in the world of strength and conditioning, really all the research prior to 1990 was heavily devoted to aerobic exercise. So we're still just finding out what strength and conditioning, or really strength training, can do for us in the context of performance improvements, enhancing immunity, enhancing endocrine function, all these different factors. So write, train, learn, modify. I said it before and I'll say it again. Throwing a bunch of stuff on the wall to see what sticks will never be the most efficient way to get things done. So start from something that you trust. To that end, keep an eye out for an additional webinar later this week, where I'm going to talk about some of the mistakes I made along the way, both as a coach and as an athlete myself. Thank you very much for your kind attention.